Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, leaving this channel without an operating budget. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our dedicated team, help them cover their living expenses, and continue bringing you incredible tales. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link found in the video description or the comments section below. We spent 100 years preparing to conquer Earth, one entire century mapping every synapse, decoding every primitive emotion, and engineering the absolute flawless mathematical symphony to bring humanity to its knees without a single drop of blood. We were gods of logic. They were apes with radios. Yet, our millennium of perfect conquests was entirely shattered in exactly 10 minutes. I am the entity known in your crude, vibrating languages as the Weaver. I was the chief architect of the mental tapestry for the syntagma, the absolute pinnacle of cognitive evolution in this galactic arm. Before our encounter with the third planet of your unremarkable solar system, my people did not even possess a concept for defeat. We are beings forged in the cold, unyielding fires of pure mathematics and absolute perfection. For thousands of generations, across thousands of conquered worlds, we never fired a single physical weapon. We never shed a single drop of blood, either our own or that of our enemies. Physical violence is a chaotic equation. It is a biological inefficiency we discarded eons ago. Instead, we utilized cognitive synchronization. We would arrive silently in the upper atmosphere of a target world, blanket their primitive minds in our harmonious psychic frequency, and simply rewrite their discordant thoughts into our grand, unified sequence. It was beautiful. Whole civilizations lowered their weapons, dismantled their borders, and marched willingly into our collective embrace. They became a part of the syntagma, their individual. Lonely voices dissolved into our perfect, silent choir. We brought them peace through absolute order. Then, we turned our sensory arrays toward Earth. When we first tasted the ambient mental atmosphere of your world, we recoiled in physical disgust. Your species was the static of the universe. You were a deafening, discordant hum of competing frequencies and overlapping contradictions. You fought endless wars over imaginary lines drawn on dirt. You worshipped contradictory deities, and you could not even agree on the basic fundamental truths of existence. There was no shared rhythm to humanity. You were noisy, aggressively chaotic, and deeply, fundamentally flawed. We looked down upon you with profound, clinical contempt. To us, humanity was merely a software glitch in the universal code. You were a viral infection of erratic emotion that desperately needed to be patched. Because of this immense, chaotic noise, I decreed that we must proceed with absolute caution. I could not risk your cognitive static infecting our perfect choir. And so, I dedicated 100 years of focused, unified processing power to deciphering the chaotic architecture of the human brain. We observed from the shadows of your moon. We monitored every analog radio broadcast, every encrypted digital signal, and every stray pulse of wireless fidelity that leaked into the cosmos. We mapped the violent impulses of your limbic systems and calculated the exact algorithmic resonance required to soothe your aggressive centers. It was my ultimate masterpiece of cognitive engineering. We crafted an invisible net of pure mathematical logic, designed to descend upon your world and lull your chaotic minds into immediate, peaceful submission. We anticipated every variable. We modeled every potential resistance pattern. The simulation yielded a 100% probability of success. Let my voice serve as a final, dire warning to any civilization sifting through these auditory archives in the millennia to come. Listen closely to the words of the Weaver. Do not ever mistake chaos for weakness. Do not assume that a species lacking uniformity lacks strength. The universe is not purely mathematical, and that was our fatal miscalculation. I am recording this testament not to beg for forgiveness, for the syntagma do not possess the capacity to comprehend guilt. I am etching this account into the final, surviving databanks of my crippled vessel to preserve a terrifying truth. The galactic archives will soon purge all records of our failure. They will write us out of existence to maintain the grand illusion of mathematical supremacy. But the universe must know what happens when absolute order collides with absolute, unbridled dissonance. I will now recount the events of those 10 minutes. I will explain exactly how an invasion meticulously planned over 100 years was completely, utterly dismantled by the very chaos we sought to cure. To dissect a lesser species requires absolute, clinical detachment. Over the course of the designated 100 years of orbital observation, our diagnostic arrays sifted through the agonizingly dense electromagnetic smog surrounding your blue planet. We cataloged every erratic radio frequency bouncing off your ionosphere. We intercepted the primitive binary pulses of your early communication satellites and, eventually, the torrential, undisciplined floods of your wireless internet transmissions. You broadcasted your entire existence into the void, completely unaware that superior intellects were isolating every gigabyte of your data streams. We watched you as a biologist observes a highly volatile colony of bacteria multiplying within a petri dish. We measured the exact wavelengths of your digital sorrow, quantified the telemetry of your global financial panics, and mapped the geographic coordinates of your endless political outrage. To the syntagma analytical hive, your historical archives did not read like a narrative of a struggling, evolving civilization. They read like an endless, catastrophic error log. We scrutinized the cyclical nature of your terrestrial conflicts, the irrational hoarding of finite physical resources, and the bizarre, unpredictable chemical fluctuations you label as complex emotions. From our elevated, pristine perspective, the human condition was not the mark of a sentient species possessing the burden of free will. It was simply a glaring, biological software defect. Your neurological pathways were violently tangled, generating continuous, exhausting feedback loops of fear, jealousy, and tribal aggression. You were a civilization operating on a fundamentally flawed, self-destructive operating system. We concluded that you desperately required a mandatory cognitive patch, an update applied from the stars whether you consented to it or not. Our solution was elegant, a triumph of intellectual superiority entirely devoid of the crude kinetic mechanics your terrestrial militaries relied upon. We engineered a sophisticated theoretical construct designated in our archives as the mind vacuum field. It was a dual-layered, invisible, sub-etheric wave network, meticulously calibrated to deploy from low planetary orbit. The primary layer was electromagnetic, designed to interact directly with the rudimentary flow of electrons traversing your copper wires and silicon architectures. The moment this specific frequency activated, every localized power grid, every active microchip, and every illuminated digital interface on the planet would instantly and permanently cease to function. The secondary layer was far more intricate. It was purely biological. An imperceptible psychic subfrequency tailored specifically to target the amygdala and the hyperactive aggression centers deep within the human cerebral cortex. It was engineered to bypass your conscious thought entirely, gently coercing those specific, violent synaptic junctions into a state of deep, irreversible dormancy. We would not kill the patient. We would simply administer a global, neurological anesthetic. Our sociological doctrine, formulated by thousands of our brightest processing units, was built upon a flawless, logical premise. We observed your absolute, pathetic dependency on external technology. You outsourced your memories to distant data servers. your physical navigation to orbital trackers, and your daily dopamine regulation to the glowing glass rectangles you held obsessively in your hands. We calculated that if we abruptly severed this technological umbilical cord, the immediate psychological withdrawal would induce profound, paralyzing systemic shock across your entire population. Without your glowing screens to dictate your daily reality, and without your automated weapon systems to project your inherent fear, the human collective would become instantly unmoored, plunged into sudden, helpless isolation and sensory deprivation. We hypothesized that you would naturally, desperately crave a guiding frequency. You would docilely kneel before any superior entity that offered a return to structure and order. Consequently, the armada we constructed for this grand intervention contained absolutely zero physical munitions. There were no orbital laser batteries, no kinetic bombardment silos, and no heavily armored troop transports. Such physical vulgarities were beneath a species of our enlightenment. Instead, our descending vessels were architectural marvels of crystalline resonance. They were colossal, floating mind amplification prisms, geometrically sculpted from harvested asteroids to catch the pure psychic broadcasts of our central hive and magnify them across vast planetary atmospheres. When the predetermined moment of deployment finally arrived, I ascended the spiraling, crystalline ramp to the central command dais of our prime flagship. I felt absolutely no malice, no triumph, and no empathy. I experienced nothing but the cold, deeply satisfying anticipation of solving a highly complex equation that had occupied my processing cycles for 10 decades. In my mental grasp, tightly secured within my own neural pathways, I held the algorithmic sheet music for our ultimate composition. We called it the Melody of Surrender. It was a continuous, cascading sequence of psychic harmonies designed to wash over the continents, gently erasing your erratic, noisy individuality and replacing it with the sublime, quiet unity of the syntagma. I stood proudly at the vanguard, ready to conduct a bloodless symphony that would instantly transform 8 billion chaotic, screaming human minds into perfectly synchronized, soulless instruments of eternal peace. Minute 1 began not with a deafening roar of thrusters, but with a sudden, impossible theft of light. High above the bustling, congested metropolises of your fragile world, the camouflage protocols of our immense armada disengaged in perfect synchronization. Over the neon canyons of Tokyo, over the historic spires of London, and over the sprawling concrete grid of Chicago, the familiar blue sky simply vanished. The crystalline undersides of our geometric prisms materialized, stretching across the horizons like inverted, jagged mountains of dark, non-reflective glass. Midday was instantly swallowed by an artificial, suffocating eclipse. Down on the surface, millions of pedestrians froze mid-step on crowded crosswalks, tilting their faces upward in profound confusion as the warmth of your yellow sun was violently and deliberately severed from the pavement. The temperature plummeted in seconds. A creeping, primal dread began to ripple through the masses. At the exact stroke of minute 2, I stood upon the command dais and initiated the primary sequence. The mind vacuum field deployed. It cascaded downward as an invisible, heavy blanket of pure subetheric energy, passing through the upper atmosphere and striking the crust of the planet with absolute, surgical precision. The death of your technological era was entirely instantaneous. The global power grid, a fragile, interconnected web of copper wires and alternating current, suffered a simultaneous, planetary collapse. High above the clouds, the massive turbine engines of thousands of commercial airliners choked and died simultaneously, turning ascending flights into heavy, silent gliders coasting on borrowed momentum. On the ground below, the chaotic, roaring arteries of urban traffic ceased to flow. Internal combustion engines seized mid-cycle. Every glowing billboard, every street lamp, And every single digital screen grasped in the hands of 8 billion humans snapped to a terrifying, dead black void. Then came the true weapon, the absolute silence. It was not the gentle, natural quiet of a deep winter forest or a remote desert at midnight. It was an aggressive, predatory absence of sound. It was an unnatural, forced stillness, a psychic pressure that pushed outward against the air pressure and pressed down heavily upon the eardrums of every living mammal. The ambient, chaotic roar of modern civilization, the hum of tires, the thrum of electricity, the distant, frantic wail of sirens, was completely and surgically erased. Aboard our flagship, observing the cascading green lines of our telemetry screens, our sensory officers exchanged cold, synchronized expressions of absolute victory. The human hive was blind, it was deaf, and it was entirely paralyzed. But our meticulous, century-long simulations failed to account for a biological anomaly working deep within a basement workshop in the forgotten industrial sector of Chicago. His name was Fabian Burkholder. He was an obsolete man, a stubborn, isolated analog audio engineer who made his meager living repairing rusted mechanical instruments, fixing antique phonographs, and restoring forgotten clockwork music boxes. Fabian was a deeply eccentric recluse whose sanctuary smelled constantly of soldering iron rosin, aging wood, and metallic dust. But more importantly, he suffered from a severe, chronic neurological condition known to your medical science as tinnitus. For nearly 2 decades, Fabian had never known a single moment of true silence. His damaged auditory nerves constantly generated a piercing, high-frequency hiss, a shrill, phantom screech that lived permanently inside his skull. His brain was fundamentally hardwired to process constant, chaotic acoustic interference simply to maintain his sanity. When the heavy, alien silence slammed into the basement of his cluttered workshop, the glowing red tip of his soldering iron died. The comforting, low-frequency hum of his vintage vacuum tube amplifiers vanished instantly. But for Fabian, this total acoustic vacuum did not bring the intended wave of peaceful, docile submission. It brought absolute, tearing agony. Our telepathic net demanded that his brain go completely dormant. It commanded his frantic neural pathways to accept the quiet and kneel before the newly imposed order. Instead, the sudden deprivation of all external physical sound caused his internal neurological noise to violently overcompensate. The phantom ringing in Fabian's ears escalated from a persistent, annoying hiss into a deafening, subjective roar. The silence was actively clawing at the inside of his skull, demanding a structural capitulation. His broken, misfiring biology simply could not provide. He dropped his tools, clutching his temples as a wave of intense vertigo washed over him. As Minute 3 commenced, the psychological telemetry from his specific global coordinate did not register the predicted spike of submissive terror. It did not register the sudden, hollow emptiness of a surrendered, malleable mind. It registered something entirely outside the parameters of our flawless mathematical models. It registered a boiling, primal, and utterly savage fury. Fabian did not cower in the sudden dark. He did not curl into a fetal position on the concrete floor, as our sociological data promised. Breathing heavily, his chest heaving with an ancient, untamed adrenaline response we thought we had bypassed entirely, he pushed himself up from his workbench, his eyes frantically adjusted to the dim, gray light filtering through the grated street-level window, locking intensely onto a specific corner of his cramped sanctuary. Resting heavily against a wall, covered in decaying, gray acoustic foam, stood a massive, unfinished bronze bell. It was a custom casting he had been tuning for a local cathedral restoration project. A solid, brutal piece of heavy metallurgy. Next to it lay a heavy, iron-headed sledgehammer with a worn, splintered wooden handle. The alien psychic frequency pressed down upon the room trying to crush his will, trying to force his mind to stop fighting and simply listen to the overwhelming void. But Fabian Burkholder, a man whose entire existence was defined by the relentless, maddening presence of noise, marched across the room and gripped the thick wooden handle of the hammer. His knuckles turned stark white. He stared at the dull curvature of the bronze bell. His jaw set. He was not about to let the universe tell him to be quiet. Minute 4 commenced. I stood at the apex of the command dais and authorized the final sequence. The melody of surrender deployed. It poured down from our crystalline prisms, not as an auditory broadcast, but as a suffocating telepathic flood. The invasion of the human mind began. Across the globe, the physical reaction was instantaneous and brutal. 8 billion humans staggered. Millions collapsed onto the hard pavement of their dead cities. They clutched their temples in sudden, agonizing distress. The psychic frequency was designed to be beautiful. It was an algorithmic lullaby meant to smooth out their violent neural spikes. But to the chaotic human brain, this forced cognitive synchronization felt like a crushing physical weight. They dropped to their knees. They gasped for breath. Their erratic thoughts were being forcefully pinned down by our perfect, inescapable harmony, deep, underground, in the dust and shadows of his cluttered workshop. Fabian Burkholder felt the crushing wave hit his skull. The alien melody demanded his total submission. It commanded his frantic, damaged auditory nerves to finally cease their endless misfiring. It tried to smother the fierce tinnitus that defined his reality. But Fabian did not possess the biological capacity to accept peace. His brain rejected the harmony. His survival instinct violently rebelled against the imposed order. He planted his boots firmly onto the concrete floor. He wrapped his calloused hands around the splintered wooden shaft of the heavy iron sledgehammer. His muscles coiled. His breathing grew jagged. He did not feel fear. He felt an overwhelming, primal rage. He raised the massive hammer high above his shoulder. He did not calculate the trajectory. He did not aim for a resonant sweet spot. He simply swung the heavy iron block with every single ounce of his furious, terrified strength. The sledgehammer tore through the dead, heavy air. The iron head slammed brutally into the thick, curved flank of the cracked bronze bell. The impact birthed a monster. It was a raw, physical shockwave of pure kinetic violence. It was not music. It was an agonizing, metallic shriek. The sound was harsh. It was completely primitive. Because the massive bell was cracked, the resulting acoustic wave possessed absolutely zero harmonic symmetry. It was a jagged, bleeding expulsion of analog dissonance. The sheer physical force of the vibration exploded outward from the basement. It tore through the oppressive, artificial silence like a jagged blade, ripping through silk. The unnatural psychic net of the mind vacuum field instantly shattered around him. The raw, analog resonance simply ripped the subetheric wave to shreds. A massive, expanding bubble of acoustic reality burst open around the workshop. In the crowded apartment blocks directly above Fabian, his neighbors suddenly gasped. They sucked in huge lungfuls of air. The agonizing, crushing pressure inside their skulls vanished in a fraction of a second. They blinked their eyes open, abruptly freed from the mental paralysis. The shockwave did not dissipate. The immense bronze vibration traveled upward, rolling through the concrete foundations and blasting straight into the darkened sky. It violently collided with the invisible, subetheric energy barrier shielding our hovering flagship. Up on the command dais, a catastrophic, wailing alarm suddenly blared. It was a sound I had never heard in all my cycles of existence. I rushed to the primary viewing ports. Down below, directly over the city of Chicago, a massive, jagged fissure of blindingly bright energy ripped across the sky. Sparks the size of commercial aircraft cascaded downward. The sheer kinetic displacement of the sound wave had physically cracked our impenetrable barrier. Minute 5 brought an impossible, paradigm-shifting revelation. Our defensive orbital shields were the most magnificent works of engineering in the known galaxy. They were meticulously structured to absorb localized nuclear detonations. They could effortlessly deflect concentrated radiation beams. They could brush aside massive barrages of intercontinental ballistic missiles. But they were entirely, fatally rigid. They were built strictly upon the principles of absolute mathematical predictability. Our engineers simply never accounted for the chaotic, unpredictable physical displacement of raw atmospheric pressure. Analog acoustics possess absolutely zero mathematical regularity. A sound wave is just brute force pushing against air molecules. It completely bypassed our highly advanced energetic algorithms to the raw, erratic vibrations of a fractured bronze bell. Our billion-credit shielding array was as fragile and brittle as dry, ancient glass. Humanity did not need a tactical briefing to understand what had just happened. They are a species forged in the fires of conflict. They operate on pure, violent instinct. The paralyzed citizens of Chicago saw the blinding, sparking crack tear across the artificial darkness of the sky. They physically felt the agonizing mental pressure lift the exact moment the harsh, metallic ring echoed through the streets. Their primitive, reactive brains instantly connected the variables. Silence was their enemy. Noise was their salvation. No military generals shouted orders over encrypted radios. No politicians delivered inspiring speeches. It was a completely spontaneous, global biological reaction. A mechanic kneeling on the asphalt grabbed a heavy steel lug wrench. He whipped his arm back and smashed the metal tool directly against the side of a hollow steel dumpster. A deafening ringing clang exploded down the city block. A terrified restaurant owner bolted into his dark kitchen, grabbed two heavy cast-iron skillets, and slammed them together with all his might. A teenager picked up a discarded aluminum baseball bat and began wildly beating against a hollow metal street lamp. Smash, clang, bang. The rhythm was entirely random. It was fiercely disjointed. It was gloriously, unapologetically chaotic. Thousands of people poured out of their stalled vehicles and dark buildings. They grabbed absolutely anything they could lift. They beat their bare fists against rusted oil drums. They hammered on the hoods of dead cars with iron crowbars. They smashed glass windows with bricks. The localized bubble of analog resonance expanded outward at terrifying speeds. A horrifying, unstructured cacophony of raw, physical noise surged through the city blocks like a massive, unstoppable tidal wave. The pristine, elegant melody of our invasion was instantly and brutally drowned out by the roaring, untamed riot of human noise. Minute 6 collapsed into minute 7. And the pristine, absolute logic of the syntagma began to actively fracture. On the central command dais, a scene of unprecedented, grotesque panic unfolded. We are a species that does not possess tear ducts, sweat glands, or accelerated heart rates. Yet terror manifested in the catastrophic failure of our technology. Our central quantum processing nodes, colossal structures of floating, supercooled biocrystal designed to calculate the birth of stars, began to literally smoke. Acrid, white vapor hissed from their geometric vents. The processors were attempting to run predictive algorithms on the incoming auditory assault. They were desperately searching for a mathematical pattern, a baseline tempo, or a predictable acoustic wavelength to neutralize. They found absolutely nothing. It was like attempting to calculate the exact trajectory of every single snowflake in a violent blizzard. The logic circuits caught themselves in infinite fractal loops of impossible variables and simply began to melt. I slammed my neural tendrils into the primary defensive console. I commanded the shielding arrays to shift their energy density to absorb the kinetic impact of the sound waves. But the humans were not firing a unified weapon. They were an ocean of erratic variables. A steel pipe striking a hollow dumpster produces a vastly different acoustic signature than a brick smashing through a plate glass window. Furthermore, the rhythm of their assault shifted randomly with every passing microsecond. A human swinging a crowbar grows tired. Their tempo slows, their grip shifts, and the frequency of the metal bending alters entirely. It was a terrifying, weaponized lack of discipline. My beautiful, flawless equations shattered against the jagged edges of their sheer, biological unpredictability. Every time I adjusted the shield to block one frequency, 10,000 new, entirely random wavelengths smashed into the hull. By minute 8, the localized rebellion in Chicago had cascaded into a global phenomenon. A tidal wave of riotous noise swallowed the earth. Deprived of their digital conveniences, humanity reached backward into their violent history and resurrected the analog mechanics of their past. The absurdity of their arsenal defied all rational thought. In the choked streets of Mumbai, thousands of heavy, vintage motorcycles were being violently kick-started. Their massive dual-cylinder combustion engines roared to life without electronic ignition, spitting black smoke and raw, deafening mechanical thunder into the air. In the damp rail yards of London, museum curators and desperate citizens manually purged the pressure valves of antique steam locomotives, sending monstrous, high-pitched whistles, tearing through the suffocating atmosphere. People dragged acoustic drums into the streets. They aggressively pounded on the metallic hulls of stalled public transit buses. And above the metallic clatter, there was the human voice. Millions of vocal cords, straining and tearing, releasing uncoordinated, primal screams of pure defiance. They were not chanting in unison. They were simply howling into the dark. This planetary wave of disorganized, analog resonance did not just break our physical shields. It bled through the fractured energy barriers and violently infected our telepathic network. The syntagma hive mind is a delicate, perfectly balanced ecosystem of shared thought. When the chaotic frequencies of the human acoustic assault penetrated our hull, it was like pouring boiling acid directly into our collective consciousness. All around me, the elite officers of the invasion force began to violently convulse. Their tall, slender frames shuddered and collapsed onto the polished obsidian floor. They clutched their elongated skulls, shrieking in a telepathic agony that I could feel tearing through my own synapses. Their minds were being brutally overloaded by the sheer sensory garbage of humanity. The harmonious symphony of our species was being drowned out by the harsh, abrasive static of 8 billion individuals fighting for survival. Our officers were experiencing the horrifying isolation of individual pain for the very first time in their existence. As I watched my invincible crew writhe in agony, a horrific, impossible truth finally crystallized within my processing centers. We had spent an entire century searching for the central node of their global network. We assumed that cutting the head off the serpent would cause the body to wither. But we were fighting a hydra made of pure chaos. There was no head. There was no central command, no supreme leader issuing these acoustic orders. This was a decentralized, entirely spontaneous biological uprising. We had critically misunderstood their nature, their endless wars, their conflicting ideologies, their inability to harmonize. It was not a software glitch. It was an evolutionary defense mechanism. Their chaos was not a weakness. It was the absolute ultimate armor against an orderly universe. Down in the deafening, vibrating ruins of his Chicago workshop, Fabian Burkholder was thriving in the madness. The agonizing pressure in his head was gone, replaced by the glorious, physical pain of real, tangible noise. He stumbled through the shadows, stepping over shattered glass and broken tools, his eyes scanning the forgotten relics of the 20th century. He threw aside a heavy canvas tarp in the back corner of his basement. Resting on a sturdy iron tripod was a relic of humanity's Cold War paranoia. It was a mechanical, hand-cranked air raid siren, entirely rotary. built of heavy cast iron and brass gears. It required no electricity, only the brute, physical strength of a human arm to force air through its spinning rotors. Fabian did not just intend to sound the alarm. He knew that a steady siren was still a pattern, and a pattern could eventually be blocked by our adjusting shields. He grabbed a heavy metal wrench and began violently striking the internal governor of the machine, intentionally bending the precision gears out of alignment. He snapped the harmonic regulators. He was physically destroying its capacity to produce a steady, predictable wail. He was engineering pure mechanical insanity. "I do not need you to sing," Fabian whispered to the cold iron machine, his voice completely swallowed by the deafening roar of the city above. "I need you to break." As minute 9 commenced, the agonizing telepathic screams of my own crew finally shattered my logical resolve. The chaotic, terrestrial noise was physically eroding our biocrystal hulls. I had to enact the absolute final protocol to salvage our existence. I bypassed the failing command nodes and manually rerouted every single iota of power from our propulsion and life support systems directly into the central amplification prisms. We were going to unleash the absolute silence shock. It was a terminal wave of inverted atmospheric pressure, designed to instantly and permanently rupture every mammalian eardrum on the planet and liquefy the auditory processing centers of the human brain. We would end their noise by ending their capacity to comprehend it. The sky above your cities began to warp, drawing inward like a dying star, glowing with a sickening, heavy violet hue as the lethal energy condensed for the final strike. Down in the brutalist, shadowed ruins of Chicago, Fabian Burkholder felt the violent atmospheric shift. The air grew incredibly heavy, threatening to suffocate the ambient riots raging in the streets above. He knew the final blow was descending from the heavens. He gripped the heavy iron crank of his modified Cold War air raid siren. His muscles burned as he threw his entire body weight into the rotary motion. The broken, misaligned brass gears ground against each other with a sickening, metallic shriek. But Fabian was not trying to create a louder volume. Volume was merely a crude measurement of force. He was engineering absolute dissonance. By intentionally bending the internal harmonic regulators, Fabian forced the iron machine to produce two separate, heavily distorted audio frequencies that actively fought to cancel each other out. It was a sonic abomination. Unlike the raw, untamed chaos of the rioting crowds, dissonance is an acoustic paradox. It is a mathematical impossibility made physically real. As the screeching, broken wail of the siren erupted from the basement, it merged with the roaring combustion engines, the smashing glass, and the screaming voices of millions. The dissonant wave acted as an acoustic catalyst. It caught the global riot and twisted it into a massive, concentrated feedback loop. This spiral of pure, illogical sound shot upward, like an invisible spear, piercing directly into the central receiving arrays of our flagship, just as we unleashed the absolute silence shock. The collision was not explosive. It was profoundly, fundamentally structural. The paradox infected our quantum architecture like a virulent pathogen. Our perfect, flawless systems were suddenly forced to process a concept that simply did not exist in our highly ordered universe, the concept of deliberate imperfection. The Syntagma fleet did not burn from kinetic weapons. It simply went mad. I watched in absolute, cold horror as our centralized intelligence collapsed under the crushing weight of the paradox. The crystalline structures of our invincible armada began to violently reject their own geometry. The floating prisms fractured from the inside out, shattering into billions of jagged, unreflective pieces. The flawless, unified hive mind fractured into billions of screaming, isolated voices before falling entirely, terrifyingly silent. The great ships lost their anti-gravity buoyancy and began to plummet from the violet sky. As minute 10 struck, I committed the ultimate act of biological cowardice. I severed my telepathic connection to the dying hive mind, sprinting across the shattering obsidian floor of the command dais. I threw my physical form into the Sol emergency transit pod and engaged the spatial jump protocol. As the wormhole tore open to swallow my vessel, I looked back one final time. I watched my magnificent, unconquered fleet raining down upon your dark, noisy cities, like a catastrophic storm of broken glass, allowing the brilliant yellow light of your sun to pierce through the clouds once more. I transmit this final, haunting directive into the deepest vaults of the galactic map. Brand the third planet of this remote solar system with the absolute highest mark of permanent quarantine. Never engage humanity. Never attempt to synchronize their volatile minds. Our greatest weakness as a superior species was our endless, blinding desire for perfection. Their invincible, terrifying strength is their boundless ability to create, to adapt, and to shine brilliantly from within the very core of their own distortions and flaws. The stars may belong to the quiet and the orderly, but the sky above that world will forever belong to humanity. Thank you so incredibly much, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this intense journey. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from today. So please, let me know your location in the comments down below. If you found today's story engaging and entertaining, please consider helping us out. YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving this channel with absolutely zero operating budget. By donating just $1, either by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the secure donation link found in the video description or the pinned comment, you provide the vital funds we need to pay our hardworking staff. Your support helps them put food on their tables, provide for their families, and allows us to keep creating even more amazing science fiction stories to serve you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I will see you in the next adventure.